Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution, which is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. Beautiful. It gets more enthusiastic and meaningful every time we recite it together, and it's especially meaningful to recite our beautiful motto tonight, because this conversation is the first installment in a series of really important national conversations over the next 2 years that the Constitution Center is hosting. And the rubric that we're convening these conversations under is a new bipartisan national commission called A Madisonian Constitution for All. Ladies and gentlemen, we are seeing grave threats today in this world between populism on the one hand and constitutionalism on the other. And new media technologies seem to be challenging values like the rule of law and individual liberty that are enshrined in the Constitution. And next Thursday, April 13th, Freedom Day, we launch a new bipartisan national commission called A Madisonian Constitution for All. It is co-chaired by Senators Mike Lee and Chris Coons and Representatives Justin Amash and Zoe Lofgren from opposite ends of the spectrum, but united by their love for the Madisonian Constitution. And we're going to ask, what would Madison and the framers think of our current presidency, Congress, courts, and the media, and how can we resurrect Madisonian values of public reason today? It's going to be a blockbuster program with the leading journalists and scholars and thought leaders in America, and it's going to kick off this really rich series of conversations over the next 2 years that's going to culminate in some very important writing and programs and thinking. And I view tonight's program as the kickoff for this crucial project because we're about to discuss a part of American constitutional history that has been neglected in recent years, but is resurrected in this absolutely brilliant and path-breaking book by Ganesh Sitaraman, The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution. Ganesh reminds us of something that we'd forgotten, which is that from the time of the framing, beginning with Madison and Jefferson, on through Andrew Jackson and Woodrow Wilson and Louis Brandeis and FDR and Harry Truman, there was a belief that a middle-class constitution and economic equality had fundamental constitutional status. And Ganesh resurrects that tradition and talks about how we might resurrect it today. But it is a beautiful reminder that populism and constitutionalism sometimes reinforce each other rather than challenging each other. And I just can't wait till you meet Ganesh and hear the conversation. And it's so exciting that talking with Ganesh is America's leading thinker and activist about the importance of resurrecting this anti-monopoly tradition. My friend Barry Lynn from the New America Foundation, who's written a brilliant book, Cornered, The New Monopoly Capitalism, in which he also talks about this forgotten constitutional tradition and talks about ways of resurrecting it. Barry has this incredible project at the New America Foundation designed to resurrect this tradition, and there are no two better people in America to talk about the middle class constitution. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ganesh Sitaraman and Barry Lynn.
Very spirited.
Welcome, very spirited. Excellent. All right, let us jump right into this important conversation. Ganesh, the book is, so Bruce Ackerman, who is my law school teacher, calls it a path-breaking effort to rethink the past, present, and future of American constitutional development. There aren't a lot of books about the Constitution that are surprising and fresh and really teach us about a tradition we hadn't remembered existed. So let's just begin with the framers, and in particular Madison, because that's the topic of the Madisonian Constitution for All Commission. You talk about Madison's vision of a middle-class constitution. What was that vision?
Well, so first, thank you very much for having me here. It's great to be here with Barry, who's done a lot of great work in this area. And it's great to be here at the National Constitution Center, which I've always thought was a real gem in Philadelphia among many, many gems in this great city. And it's always been one of my favorite things to both come here whenever I'm in town and pay my respects across the way at Independence Hall. So thank you all for coming, and thanks for being here. One of the things I think is surprising to all of us, and maybe to you, is even the title of this book, The Crisis of the Middle Class Constitution. But what does the middle class have to do with the Constitution? You can read the Constitution, it doesn't have the word middle class anywhere in it, doesn't say economic equality in it, doesn't say economic inequality in it. But what's surprising, I think, is that the Constitution, our Constitution, was built on an understanding that we in America would have a big middle class and not too much economic inequality. And maybe that seems shocking to you, but if you think back to the late 18th century, to the time of the founders, America was actually a relatively egalitarian place. It was a sparsely populated set of settlements on the eastern seaboard of the Atlantic. There were some cities, but they were modest in size: Philadelphia, New York, Boston. And what was striking is how different America was from Europe, which was really the center of civilization for the people here. Unlike Europe, there was no hereditary aristocracy in America. Unlike Europe, there was no feudalism in America. And unlike Europe, there were these vast lands available to the West, which meant that any white man, and it was limited to white men, we can talk more about that later, could get a parcel of land and have a shot at economic opportunity and be a full member in a way that wasn't possible in Europe. And so this economic equality, I argue in the book, was actually the foundation for our constitutional system. And people at the time, including Madison, understood that this was the foundation for our constitutional system.
I want to take a couple of beats on this. Barry, amplify Ganesh's introduction about Madison thoughts in particular. Before I read Ganesh's history, I remember Madison talking about the preservation of our unequal faculties of acquiring property being the primary purpose of government. So I hadn't thought of Madison as a Jeffersonian economic populist, unlike Jefferson, who proposes an amendment to the Constitution that fails, that would have banned Congress from setting up monopolies with exclusive privileges. So if you're going to make the case to the audience for why Madison and Jefferson embraced this vision of the anti-monopoly Constitution, what would that case be?
It's looking at Madison, and actually before I get into that, I would actually like to amplify what Ganesh just said, which is it really is an honor to be here, and this is a great city and a great institution. I wish to have this conversation, but Madison, when you look at his writings, at the time of the Constitutional Convention and in the 1790s. He has a reputation that comes from later in his life as being somewhat more conservative than Jefferson. But in the 1790s, it was very clear that Madison was pretty much as much of an anti-monopolist as Jefferson. And the reason he was an anti-monopolist was precisely to ensure an equality of condition. Because without the equality of condition, he understood there could not be democracy. You could not have a republic. You could not have personal liberty. And I think it's important also to understand what the goal was of, what was Jefferson and Madison, what were they really thinking about? What was their goal? And it was, democracy was actually not the end goal. Democracy was a pathway to the goal. And the end goal was really to have independent citizens with complete control over their own destinies, complete control over their own faculties, complete ability to engage in an open, deliberative conversation with one another so that they could actually make day-to-day a society and day-to-day decisions about how to maintain this society. I would say that, Madison at that point was, Madison and Jefferson they had different approaches, but they complemented each other perfectly.
Beautiful. Ganesh, you talk both about some of the specific things that Jefferson proposed to ensure equality, including laws restricting the transfer of property. Madison also had on his list withholding unnecessary opportunities from a few to increase their property by accumulating wealth. You talk about Madison at the end of his life worrying that by 1930 America would grow so large that economic inequality would increase and democracy would be threatened. And you even point to particular clauses in the Constitution, in particular Article 1, Section 10, which forbids the states from laying imposts or duties, which they'd done to raise revenues, which you say embody this Madisonian vision. So give us more detail to persuade the conservative originalists in this audience that Madison actually was a champion of the middle-class constitution.
So one of the things, and I'll take the last example you gave, which is Article 1, Section 10. And in Article 1 of the Constitution, there's a lot of things going on. But one of the important ones is that the federal government is empowered to create an impost or a tariff, and the states are denied the power to create these imposts and tariffs. And usually we just think about this as being part of creating a national commerce, a kind of one nation in terms of a sense of the economy, as opposed to the Articles of Confederation where we had much more fragmented economy. And that's where the story starts, that's where the story ends, normally. But I think there's another part to this story. And the other part of the story is thinking back to what was going on in the 1780s. And in the 1780s, after the American Revolution, the country fell into a massive depression. And some economic historians say that this was actually worse than the Great Depression. And the result of this depression is at the same time that the people are really suffering economically, the government needs revenue. It needs revenue at the central level to be able to pay the people who loaned us the money to fight the war. That's the European governments. It needs money to pay soldiers who are fighting Indians and to pay veterans. It needs money to just operate as a government. And it can't raise this money through taxes because it doesn't have the power to do that. It can't raise this money through a tariff because Rhode Island vetoes the tariff, and every state was allowed to veto any national policy of that type. And so all the government can do is ask the states, please give us money. And so what the states do is they impose taxes on ordinary people, poll taxes, head taxes, all kinds of taxes on ordinary people who are in the midst of a depression. And so people are suffering, and then they're hit by these taxes, and as a result, some of them are off to debtor's prison, and most of them actually revolt. And so you may have heard of Shays' Rebellion, one of the great rebellions in this time period, but there's revolts happening all over America. And we often forget this, but this is something that's really concerning to a lot of people at the time. And the result is states push forward paper money, they change contracts to help debtors, and they do a lot of these things. And the traditional story is the Constitution is an aristocratic counter-revolution pushing back against these crazy populist debtors in the 1780s. But I think the question we have to ask ourselves if we're going to buy that story is, well, if the founders were a bunch of aristocrats, well, why didn't they rig the system more? Why did they stop where they did? Why didn't they just go whole hog and say, let's have property requirements for becoming a senator or a member of the House or a number of other things? And the reason is you would never get that passed. In a country where there's revolts going on, including armed revolts like Shays' Rebellion, how are you going to impose an aristocratic constitution on the people of a democratic country? And the answer is that they didn't. There was actually something for all these ordinary people in the Constitution, and it was this provision on tariffs. And that seems crazy. How could tariffs be about this? But the reason was that when you impose a tariff at a national level, the states wouldn't have to tax all the ordinary people. The government would get its revenues from the tariff, and the burden of the tariff would be borne by wealthier types of people, usually those who lived in cities, who were the kinds that wanted fancy imported manufactured goods from Europe. And ordinary artisans and agriculturalists out in the country didn't need to get those fancy goods. And so, in fact, the tariff created something like a progressive tax system to fund the government. And so our Constitution actually has built into it something for ordinary people, not just for the wealthiest people, even though that's kind of the conventional story we're often told. And I think that's an important part of how our middle-class Constitution was built and was sustained for a long time.
Completely fascinating. Barry, the standard story is that the populism of Jefferson, and now Ganesh tells us Madison too, was countered by the aristocratic tendencies of the rap star of the moment, Hamilton. And yet Ganesh has a notion that Hamilton too presumes a certain equality of conditions and does not favor the rule of aristocrats over the people. Was there a split between the Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian wings? Is that exaggerated, or did both sides embrace a version of this anti-monopoly tradition?
First, I want to say that Ganesh's his analysis about the progressive nature of the tariff, I think, is really groundbreaking and important. And that alone is reason enough to read this book. As for Hamilton being, someone who accepted sort of equality of condition as a permanent state, I think that's probably pushing it a bit. And this is actually a good way to sort of explain or just to illustrate the importance of anti-monopolism, fighting monopoly in the commercial sector, in the political economy. And one of the things that happened after the Constitution, one of these rebellions that Ganesh was talking about was the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion it began because Hamilton wanted to extend this taxation at the federal level to whiskey. He saw this as a way to actually lower taxes on the tariff. And he did so in a way that was actually structured to concentrate the production of whiskey in the hands of rich people, the lords of the local manors. And whiskey it's not just whiskey, it wasn't something you drank, it was actually a way of taking your corn. It was a way of taking your product. If you were like way out in western Pennsylvania, there were two ways that you'd save your corn over the winter. One was you turn it into whiskey, the other was you turn it into pigs. And then you could easily move pigs and whiskey to the coast and get money for it. What Hamilton did is he said, I'm actually going to take away this ability to take your corn and turn it into whiskey. I'm going to turn it over to the local aristocrat. And the people rebelled against that. They rebelled against the tax structure that was designed to concentrate the wealth. Hamilton then raised an army. It was the largest army ever raised in America at that time, 13,000 men. And they marched from the coast all the way out to western Pennsylvania to put down this rabble of whiskey rebels. I think maybe they hung one person or something, because most people just vanished into the woods. But it was at this point that, George Washington himself abandoned this venture because he didn't agree with it. He thought this was too much. And it was a lesson to all of the people of the United States at that time about two things. One is the danger of monopoly, of concentrating power in the hands of the few, and the role that the government can play in concentrating power in the hands of the few through monopoly. So anti-monopolism from that moment forward became, at the folk level, and then sort of over time more and more built into law. It was the way of extending checks and balances into the political economy to avoid concentration of power in concentration of wealth and power in the political economy that might endanger the distribution of power that had been effected in our government.
So can I say one thing about Hamilton?
You please say many things. I just want to put on a plug. When you're leaving the show, as you go down the stairs, go to the presidential power exhibit, and you'll see George Washington's pardon of the two people who were convicted in the Whiskey Rebellion right downstairs. Talk about Hamilton and then take the anti-monopoly tradition up through Jackson and a little bit further so that we can understand its evolution and how eventually the Republican Party too came to embrace protective tariffs, originally to protect workers, although it came to be engines of protecting the trusts.
So I'll say one thing about Hamilton. So Hamilton, as we all know, is famously more of sometimes a monarchist or an executive power fan, sometimes is considered an elitist, champion of the national bank. And so one of the things that I find interesting and that I talk about in the book is that while we know all of this about Hamilton, and we think about that, and that's his public persona in his public life much after the convention and the creation of the Constitution, during the period of the ratification debates, right, when we're actually deciding in public, are we going to accept this document or not? Even Hamilton, maybe the most aristocratic of the founders, makes arguments that are not aristocratic. His argument is not, this is a great constitution because rich guys like me or my aspiration to be rich are going to win. His argument is, this is a constitution that's defined for all of the people, and it allows everyone equality economically, and it is built on that equality. And that's important because when we think about interpreting the Constitution, what's important is not the secret things that people said in letters or the secret notes that happened in Philadelphia. What's important is what we the people thought we were doing when we did it. And in fact, everyone agreed. Anti-Federalists and Federalists agreed about the importance of economic equality for having a republic. And this was in part exactly why Hamilton made those arguments, was because it was a general belief in the population. I think an indicator that even someone like Hamilton wanted to go in that direction tells us something about what the general public believed at the time, because he thought that would be persuasive to the general public. So kicking the story forward a little bit, this is the early republic, but as we move forward, we really start to see strains on the kind of economic foundations of our constitutional system as early as the very beginning, maybe, in the kind of national bank story, but really starting in the 1820s and 1830s, when commerce expands significantly, what one historian has called the market revolution. And in that period, we see increasing commerce, we see increasing wealth, we see the creation of factories in places like Lowell, Massachusetts. And as a result, we also see a backlash to this and concern that the new commerce is going to create problems. And in the Jacksonian period, that manifests itself most famously in the debate over the National Bank, where Andrew Jackson pushes back ferociously against the efforts to recharter a national bank, and in fact vetoes the creation of the National Bank, saying that on constitutional grounds, he thinks it is an unconstitutional exercise of power and that it will concentrate privileges in the hands of a few elites and wealthy people, and that this is the kind of thing that will turn us into an aristocracy rather than a real democracy. And that is part of his story, a constitutional argument for rejecting the National Bank in the 1830s. And so we see this kind of anti-monopoly story, the bank being the great monopoly at the time, as part of our constitutional history. By the time we get to the Gilded Age, the late 19th century, we see a big shift. And even Republicans and Democrats, both in this era, think of things a little bit differently. You see populists and progressives acting against the increased concentration of wealth and power that emerges from a combination of industrialization, urbanization, the closing of the frontier, the shift from agricultural and artisanal labor to wage work in factories, and the rise of the corporation, and then the conglomeration of corporations known as the trust, that really put pressure on the economic foundations of our constitutional system.
Great. Okay, we're covering a lot of crucial history, but now, Barry, we're converging around the Gilded Age and the Progressive era. And as Ganesh signaled, and as you've well written, by 1912, all three candidates in the election of 1912 are opposed to the moneyed power, but Woodrow Wilson and Louis Brandeis want to break up the trusts. Theodore Roosevelt wants big regulatory bodies to oversee the big corporations, and William Howard Taft, that unsung hero who's going to get a big plug next January when my pay-in to him comes out, wants more vigorous antitrust. I'm doing a book on William Howard Taft. Yeah, exactly. Who you were quite generous to in your account. He wants more vigorous antitrust prosecution. But Barry, how did this consensus among the three parties about the dangers of the monopoly power crystallize? And maybe this is another question, but I have to ask it. Ganesh, John Marshall rejected Andrew Jackson's constitutional arguments and upheld the banks. And by the Gilded Age period, the Supreme Court has become the enemy of economic populism, striking down the income tax, ruling against regulation of the sugar trust and so forth. So what happens to the constitutional strain of this argument, or does it just become exclusively political? Lots in there right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, 1912 is one of the most important years, that election, for really understanding political economics and politics in the United States, looking at that election. And of the three candidates, I mean, what you ended up with that year is three different visions of how to organize the political economy and really how to organize society. And the Teddy Roosevelt, is widely seen, popularly seen as the great trust buster. That's a very difficult, if you look closely at what Teddy Roosevelt did and said, that is really an impossible position to defend. Teddy Roosevelt really saw trusts, concentration of power as something that was natural, that was inevitable. He was reading a lot of European sort of political economics at the time, sort of tinged with Marxist theory. And he believed that what you needed to do was that people should do is democratically elect a president and then stick that president and the executive on top of highly concentrated enterprises and have the executive direct those enterprises to ensure that they serve the people's interest. So it's democracy here, concentration here. I'm going to leave Taft out of it now just because, to keep it short, just jump over to the truly opposed, the diametrically opposed position, and that was of Wilson and Woodrow Wilson and Louis Brandeis. And what they held is that if you concentrate power here, then that power ultimately is going to escape your control. And that power will at some point be privatized, and that power will be used to take over your government and subject it to private autocracy. And in fact, in the writings of Wilson and Brandeis in 1912, 1913, 1914, they spoke repeatedly about autocracy. They spoke repeatedly about tyranny. And this was not mere rhetorical devices they were using to gather votes. This was something that was deeply held. They saw the vision that TR was promoting was profoundly dangerous to American freedom. And they promoted, so their key to fixing that was the modernization of anti-monopolism. And I'm not going to go into any detail about that now, but it's like what they did is they took the anti-monopoly principles of Jefferson and Madison and Jackson and people like Sherman, Senator Sherman, and they adapted them to the industrial era. And they actually, in doing that, they established those principles in ways that they were able to allow FDR and the other New Dealers, people like Wright-Patman in Congress, to really rebuild the American economy as a middle-class economy, to restore the middle-class constitution in the mid-20th century.
Ganesh, I jumped ahead, and I'm glad Barry did, and very crystallized the stakes in the election of 1912, but fill in some of the details about what happened between the Jacksonian era and the Progressive era, and you give this riveting history of the protective tariff, which the Republicans are embracing as initially an engine for economic equality, but then becomes converted into an engine of oppression once the trusts get involved. So sort of take us through that history and how the Democrats and the Republicans in the Progressive era are both struggling with the question of economic equality through the tariff.
So one of the things that happens in the late 19th century is that everybody understands that the economic pressures, well, not everybody, but everybody on the populist and progressive side understand that the economic changes that are happening in the economy are a fundamental threat to our constitutional system. So there's a strong tradition of people who are very concerned about this change. And what they try to do is come up with ways to address this set of problems. The things I talked about before, industrialization, urbanization, and so on. And so some of the things they do are very creative. As Barry said, they invent antitrust as a modernization of anti-monopoly thinking in this period. But they also create the constitutional amendment for an income tax, which hadn't existed before, and that's a new thing. Those two things are on the economic side. On the political side, they try to prevent the concentration of economic power from bleeding into a concentration of political power. And so they pass campaign finance regulations. They pass a constitutional amendment so that senators are directly elected by the people instead of being selected by state legislatures, which are in some cases rife with bribery and influence from big corporate interests. And so they're trying to create both an economic democracy and a political democracy because they see that these two things are linked together. Now, part of that story is the tariff, the kind of continuing story of the tariff. And it's linked to the story of the income tax. And so what happens in the late 19th century is while the tariff is protective and helps infant industry in America, as you get this concentration of economic power through corporations and then the trusts, you see less competition domestically. So what that means is now you have high tariffs, which means there isn't competition from abroad, but you also have no competition at home because you have these monopolies running everything. So what that means is you have higher prices for everybody and worse services. And if you need an example of that, the kind of classic one that most people understand is Comcast. You pay a lot of money, you don't get great service. This is what a monopoly does in most places.
You're in Philadelphia, remember?
Right, so suited to our current context. And so the challenge is, what do you do about that? And one of the things they do is they say, well, the tariff isn't working for us in the same way anymore as it used to work. And so one of the arguments, and it's not the only argument, but it's one of the arguments for the income tax, is maybe if we shift, we can get rid of this tariff as a way to fund the revenue to have the government function, and we can move that over to income taxes. And that will solve a couple of problems. One, it solves this tariff problem, which is just supporting the trusts. But the other problem that it solves is it allows us to tax wealthier people, and so people who have a greater ability to pay can now pay more. And so again, it's this progressive idea that we should have a balance that supports ordinary people and allows wealthier people to pay their fair share. That again existed in the early republic. It was about creating a tariff. Here it means getting rid of a tariff and shifting back to taxes as a way to fund the government. So kind of an interesting shift in how that happens over the late 19th century.
Fascinating. And for what it is a footnote for a broader discussion, but poor President Taft did, unlike Roosevelt, manage slightly to reduce the tariff, but then was undone by the politics of it. And it took Woodrow Wilson to pass the meaningful Mann-Elkins bill, which reduced it further. Barry, a beat on the constitutional question. In the Jacksonian era, there was a principle that class legislation was forbidden by the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. You couldn't take property from A for the purpose of giving it to B, and that protected the interests of small farmers and businessmen. But in the Progressive era, that principle was invoked to strike down maximum hour and minimum wage laws and became an engine of conservatism rather than progressivism. The Supreme Court strikes down the income tax on dubious grounds, even though Alexander Hamilton had successfully persuaded the court to uphold an excise tax in 1796. And that's why you need the income tax amendment. And basically, and the court refuses to allow the regulation of manufacturing rather than commerce. So the conservative court basically thwarts progressive reform. The question is, what happened to the constitutional dimension of the anti-monopoly or middle-class constitution? And if you were trying to resurrect it today in a particular constitutional clause, where would you locate it?
Going back to the Jacksonian stance that you didn't want to have class, any kind of policy that promotes a particular class over another class. That ended up, I would say that survived into the 20th century in ways that ended up being foundational to the democracy that we maintained in the 20th century. And this idea that there shall be no discrimination by any institution that has the power to govern, it's, whether it's the public government or a private monopoly that we decide not to break up, like a railroad or an electric utility or a telephone company. The way that there's immense power as the people began to understand by the 1860s, 1870s in a railroad. A railroad, if it is allowed to discriminate, if it's allowed to haul, say, Jeff's grain before Ganesh's grain, it can use that power to discriminate over time to get power over both Jeff and Ganesh and to get power ultimately over their property. So this principle that there shall not be discrimination applied to a government, which is a railroad that has a monopoly, a natural monopoly, and has the power, therefore, to govern people that depend on it, the principle was extended to that. And it was the common carriage principle. And that common carriage principle, we actually did in my unit recently, we looked at we did an article in the Washington Monthly. You may find it of interest. It's called Populism with a Brain. It came out last June. And the basic question was, the question that we asked, if Brandeis were to wake up today and look at America today, what would he do in all these different areas? And in case after case after case, the principle that would be brought to bear is non-discrimination. no class discrimination. And so I'm going to duck the question about where you would take, where in the Constitution you would plant this, because I think it's actually built into the Constitution as we understand it. And just say that this is the fundamental question that we as a people now face in dealing with Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple, which are the railroads of our time and have a license up to this point to discriminate.
So if I could ask the same question to you, just because the answer is really important. I understand why Barry ducks it. Maybe one reason is that Brandeis got suspicious of this doctrine. It's called substantive due process. The due process clause says no state shall deprive any person of liberty without due process of law. That was the clause that these courts used to say, hey, you can't take property from this person and give it to that person. But when conservative judges use it to strike down maximum hour and minimum wage laws, Brandeis and other progressives began to favor judicial restraint and said, don't make up these liberties that aren't in the Constitution. Is that the most natural home for the anti-monopoly Constitution, and is it no longer available now that it's gotten out of fashion because of its misuse in the progressive era, or is there some other place to resurrect this through the courts?
So I think there's a couple of things that we need to think about. One is, and you raised it slightly before in an earlier question about Jackson, and the question is, versus John Marshall, the Chief Justice,
Yeah.
and one question is, how much is the Constitution owned by the Supreme Court? And the answer to that is that throughout our history, it actually wasn't really owned by the Supreme Court. That's kind of a new invention, that we all seem to defer to the court fully as the arbiter of all constitutional meaning. In fact, for much of our history, people believed that we, the people, get to help shape the meaning of the Constitution, that it was shaped through our popular actions, that it manifested through our elected officials who would debate constitutional questions on the floor of the House, on the floor of the Senate, who would take action because they thought it was constitutionally required of them, who would question whether they could take action because maybe it was constitutionally forbidden. We had presidents who did that as well. So when Jackson vetoes the bank, he's making his own constitutional determination. And he says, look, I don't care what John Marshall said. I'm making my own determination about what is constitutionally allowed. So there was a sense that the Constitution was owned by the people. Scholars call this popular constitutionalism, or departmentalism if it's housed in one of the departments of government. And that was a robust tradition that in some ways we've given up on a little bit, and I think too much, in our popular consciousness over the last, say, 50 years or so, as we've been willing to defer to the court for everything instead of embracing that we get to shape some of the meaning of the Constitution. So that's one thing I would say is the Constitution, in part, means what we think it means and what we want it to mean. The second thing that's important is that when we look at the Constitution, it has a lot of pieces to it that may shape this. So one important part is the powers granted to the federal government under Article 1 of the Constitution. And there's classic places that allow for Congress to do a variety of things in this area that have been well settled for many, many decades now, the Commerce Clause being the most important and common of those, where under the Commerce Clause, Congress can regulate a variety of things that affect national commerce. Obviously, things like the structure of monopolies that operate across multiple states would fit within Congress's purview in that regard. So I think that's a place where there is ability for them to act in order to try to do this. Now, what that means, though, is it's incumbent on Congress, the political branches, then to act to try to create a system that is anti-monopolistic in its structure. And I think that's an important piece of the duties then that are required of our elected officials is to try to build those constitutional principles into the policies that they put forward.
Well, that eloquent challenge, Barry, leads me to note that we're speaking today on the day that the nuclear option was exercised and the filibuster ended in the Senate. And today, senators of both parties talked about a death spiral for the Senate and lamented the end of deliberation that might make it possible to have bipartisan comity. Barry, is it fair to say that neither party, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans today, are committed to the anti-monopoly tradition? And tell us how it was possible that we moved from a world where in 1912 all three parties were committed to it to the world today where neither is.
In 1912, all three parties were committed to anti-monopolism. By the 50s, the two main parties were fully committed to Brandeisian anti-monopolism. There was the TR tradition had been wiped from the world. Eisenhower was, in certain respects, more of a Brandeisian than FDR. Nixon, I hate to bring him up as an operator in this tradition, actually had a lot of Brandeisian sort of blood in him in his approach to thinking about the role of small enterprise, the social role of small enterprise. He was the son of a shopkeeper. But what happened is that the world in which I grew up, the world in which most of you grew up, was one that was shaped by Jeffersonian principles, Madisonian principles, as updated by Wilson, Brandeis, FDR's team in the early 20th century, and applied to our political economy. And really, one way to understand what happened in 1912 is that 1912 and the period around there was the Second American Revolution. We all know that there were plutocrats. We all have heard these stories about how powerful the plutocrats were, how powerful J.P. Morgan was on Wall Street, having concentrated all that power. And then one day there were no plutocrats. What happened was the Second American Revolution against concentrated wealth, and that was the Wilsonian, Brandeisian, Rooseveltian Revolution, the New Freedom, and the New Deal. That became the standard operating code for both parties until the 1970s. And that's when you see this new set of ideas that started to be promoted. And it was a set of ideas, you've heard probably about the Chicago School. It was people like Judge Posner, it was Milton Friedman, it was Alan Greenspan, and it was Robert Bork and a few others. They put this idea that anti-monopoly should not be used, as we had used it for 200 years, it should not be used to protect our democracy. It should not be used to protect our liberties. It should not be used to protect our communities. It should be used to promote efficiency in the name of the consumer. So the radical concentration of power that we have seen in this country, which is extreme and growing by the day, was achieved by the flipping of an ideological switch. We had this one set of ideas, and the Chicago scholars came forward and they said, let's just switch those ideas. And they were able to do it by changing the guidelines within the Department of Justice. This is a simplification, but the guidelines that they use to interpret all anti-monopoly law, all competition policy in the United States. And they switched it from being, we just want competition and we want to distribute power because it's safer, to we are going to allow efficiency, we're going to promote efficiency by allowing concentration. That came up, it kind of pushed up first within the Republican Party, but it was put into place in 1982 in the merger guidelines of 1982 under Reagan. The Democratic Party at that point, soon thereafter, adopted the same ideas. So the Reagan Revolution in antitrust was completed by a fellow named Bill Clinton. President Obama followed that same tradition until his last 6 months in office, and then he began to realize that there was something terribly awry. But right now, there's a lot of thinking in both parties. Mike Lee, who's going to be here on the Republican Party, is one of the leaders of the rethinking of concentration on the Republican side. There's a lot of, this week actually, in the Gorsuch hearings, we saw for the first time discussions about corporate power and monopoly in a hearing about a Supreme Court nominee. For the first time in a very, very long time. That's an indication of just how rapidly things are changing, but we're not anywhere near where we need to be yet.
Wow. Okay, Ganesh, these questions are so smart that I want to get to them because our audience is so engaged. But one beat from you on this big question of how we move from the 1912 world where all parties are anti-monopoly to today, and talk about the role of the civil rights movement as well. According to some oversimplified stories, Democrats in the 1960s became more focused on equality for women, for racial minorities, and less focused on economic populism for white guys from the South. That's a crude story. In your view, the crusade for racial and gender equality can coincide with that for economic equality. So big question, but tell us how we got from 1912 to today.
Yeah, so I'll actually start back a little bit before that and give you the scope of the whole thing. So, as I said before, in the founding period, a lot of the middle class tradition is focused on white men, right? I said that at the beginning. And the tradition I describe, though, is not exclusively about that. The way I would describe it is the middle class constitutional tradition requires that to have a republic, you have relative economic equality within the political community. And then the question is, who's in the political community? And this is a question that's obviously been fiercely contested in our history, including violently contested in our history. But then there's another tradition that we can trace through our history, which is an expansionary or inclusive tradition that has expanded who's in the political community to include women and minorities over a period of time. What I think is important is what happens when these two traditions overlap and intersect. When you expand the political community, to make the middle class constitutional tradition work, you now have to ensure that all the new members of the political community can also join the middle class. Or else your constitutional system is not going to work on the theory that it was initially built. And what's important is that throughout our history, people understood this. So in the Reconstruction period, right after the Civil War, what you see are Reconstruction Republicans in the North, including Thaddeus Stevens, a congressman from here in Pennsylvania, I think just maybe an hour away from here is his district, who actually advocated for confiscating the top 10% of lands from the wealthiest, the lands from the top 10% of rebel planters in the South, and redistributing that land to the now freed slaves, former slaves of the South, in 40-acre parcels. This is the period where you get the idea of 40 acres and a mule. And the reason was because he understood that you couldn't just have emancipation and political rights. You also needed economic justice and economic opportunity to go along with it. And without this, he said, the South could not be a true republic, and that it had never been a true republic up until that point because it didn't have this notion of economic opportunity and equality alongside political opportunity. Fast forward to the civil rights movement, as you mentioned, when Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech, the March on Washington, the actual title of that march is the March for Jobs and Freedom. It's about economics and political freedom as well, not just one, not just the other. So there was a sense that these two things have to go together. And I think one of the real challenges that we've faced in the last few generations, or generation or so, is seeing potentially these things as separate. And not seeing them as things that can work together, that across all groups we should think about ourselves as being in a shared project of trying to rebuild the middle class, rather than seeing this as some sort of zero sum between us and them.
Okay, there's so many great questions. Let's get through as many of them as we can. The first is the kind of what happens next question, and that is what can be done to create awareness among the middle class today around what is happening and motivate them to take action. Barry, you have an entire project around this goal. Tell us what some of its planks are.
Yeah, in terms of creating awareness, it's, as Jeff said, we have a project, and it's been, I started I realized that there had been a revolution in how we do anti-monopolism. It was probably about 17, 18 years ago. I started to work on it in a very dedicated way about 15 years ago. And it was just basically shining a light on the issue and doing it through journalism and gathering money at a certain point, trying to hire other journalists to help us, and then working with, in some cases, some friendly politicians, our friend Zephyr Teachout, and then just building a community of people. And I can tell you it was, in terms of getting people to pay attention, for 15 years, it was like it was pushing a boulder up a mountain. And then this last year, it became easier to push because suddenly we see all of this attention being paid by people like Senator Elizabeth Warren gave a fantastic speech about monopoly last June 29th. You can actually see it on our website. You can see it or read the text.
What's the website address? What's the website address?
It's just if you look at the Open Markets Program at New America under events. And that speech was of immense importance. That was the most important speech on concentrated economic power in this country in the last 80 years, since the 1930s, by a major public figure. Now, why haven't you heard about that speech? Because I would guess that most of you did not know that Elizabeth Warren gave a really terrific speech. It's probably because most folks, most of you get your news from New York Times, NPR. We didn't get those. We didn't get those that time. Brexit had happened 2 days before. So that's why. But the knowledge is spreading. We get calls every day from people in Congress, people in the Senate, from people running for governor in Virginia right now. So if you haven't heard yet, certainly you can learn more on our website, which is the Open Markets Program at New America. But it's coming. This is the story that's going to dominate, if not 2018, certainly 2020.
Ganesh, you at the end of your book have a series of proposals for resurrecting this tradition, and I won't. You've obviously got to buy the book after the show, so you can read them there. I want to get to some more questions. One, you also talk about deeply in the book, how would the Founding Fathers view ever-increasing wealth gaps in today's U.S.?
So to say something about what we can do forward and
Sure.
how would they view this, I think, as I said at the beginning, part of this tradition of what it meant to have a republic is that you needed to have relative economic equality. And we didn't talk much about it, but I'll take you back to the reason why. The real reason why is because in a society that's deeply divided between rich and poor, the great fear is that one of two things happen. Either the rich oppress the poor or the poor confiscate the wealth of the rich. And the result is strife, violence, and revolution. And that was the history of governments from the ancients all the way through until the 18th century. And the way that ancient governments solved this problem was they built economic class right into the structure of government. And that is a fundamental thing that we don't do in our Constitution. We have no tribune of the plebs like they had in ancient Rome. We don't have a House of Lords. And that's a very fundamental shift that I think is radical about our Constitution. And that's why I think the founders would be worried about the extreme increase in wealth inequality that we've seen in the recent generation in America, is because it really undermines the foundations on which they built our system. And so the question is, what do we do about this? And I think there's a lot of things that we can all do about it. Part of it is, having conversations and being out there, particularly with your political leaders, with people just in your communities, and building awareness about why this stuff matters. And I think there's a lot more engagement now than we've seen in a long time, and a lot more people are excited about being active. And that's essential, because one of the interesting things that you find when you read when you do history like this, is that you find that change doesn't happen because a small number of people sitting around decide they want to change things. Change happens because they're there, and they decide that they should change things, and they're forced to do so by thousands and thousands of people across the country who are mobilized, who are engaged, and who push and push and push. And they don't push on one day going to one march. They don't push with one letter or one phone call. They push in a sustained way over a long period of time, and sometimes over weeks, months, years, decades. And that's really important, because that's how the change actually happens. It doesn't happen in one moment. There's no savior who will come and rescue all of us overnight from our from the ills of our society. We do it, and we build it over a period of time. So I think that's a really important piece of it. And so what do? I think one part is antitrust and the anti-monopoly tradition that Barry's working on. I think another part of it is thinking about how we can improve opportunity for a lot of our people. Education is a big part of that story, and the crushing student loan debts that a lot of people face today, and how the system doesn't really work in higher ed financing. I think there's a lot of benefits that we can think about that are don't really work in the modern economy. So we have a system that was built on what some people call, and I refer to in the book as the Treaty of Detroit, where you're going to work at the same employer for your whole life, and you're going to get benefits like healthcare through your employer. Well, that's not really what the world that people today live in. Most people shift employers all the time. Lots of people want to start companies. They do other things. We need a new system for how we think about all of that. So there are different things we can do there on the economic side. But then we also have to treat the political side. And as the progressives would have told us, it's things like campaign finance reform. It's reshaping our politics so it's more democratic and more responsive to the people and less responsive to powerful interests. And I think that's going to be as important an effort to do that. And the way we get that done is by making sure that the concerns that our political leaders have are these concerns. This is the stuff they're interested in. This is the stuff that they talk about. And maybe if you'll indulge me, I'll just tell you one story from history. I think one of the most interesting questions to ask is, how is it possible that we got the direct election of senators amendment? And the reason why is because it's astonishing to think about what has to happen for this amendment to go through. First, you've got to get the senators who were selected under the model of legislatures, state legislatures picking senators, to agree to get rid of the model that got them their jobs. They know this is a good model for them because they got their job through this model. They're going to have to get rid of that. Dicey what happens when the people get to vote. You don't know if you're going to keep your job. Second thing is you got to get all the state legislatures to agree to give up their power to pick the senators. Well, people don't like giving up their power. So how did this happen? And the answer was something called the Oregon system, the Oregon plan. And what happened in Oregon is people said, we're going to require our state legislators to agree, and it was like a litmus test. You have to agree to take the popular position on senators. And then, because they had passed initiatives and referenda, they got a non-binding initiative on the popular preference for who should be a senator. And because they forced all their elected representatives into picking this, into agreeing to this, anybody who violated this, they would say they're going to vote out. And as a result, state legislatures started turning and just picking whoever the people picked. And then it became easy, and senators were selected in effect through this popular mechanism. But that's how you got change, and it was people forcing their representatives to give up the power that the representatives didn't want to give up. But that's a story about popular pressure, and it's a story about engagement from the people. And I think that's an important one, an important lesson that we need to remember today, is that we actually do have the power to do this, even in places where it's severely entrenched kind of power. We've done that before, and I think we can do it again.
It's a great story, and you say in the book that a kind of Oregon system should be used to pass a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, requiring representatives to pledge to vote for such an amendment before people will vote for them.
And I think that's the place. Ask your representatives, why don't they support that? And they should support that. And if they really care about draining the swamp if you're a conservative, or ending the rigged game and the political revolution if you're a kind of Bernie Sanders progressive, why aren't they supporting those kinds of things? Why aren't they taking serious action to actually do that?
We have time, alas, for just one more question in this completely fascinating discussion, and it's a great one. Barry, the question is, in light of the election of Donald Trump, does populism today support the anti-monopoly Constitution or threaten it?
Well, I mentioned earlier the article that we wrote in the Washington Monthly back in June, which is called Populism with a Brain. And the first page of that was an effort to take the word populist back from Trump for the people, because that's what it means. It means people's power. The Populist Party was the People's Party. And the Europeans, there was a group of people in the United States in the 50s and 60s kind of afraid of the McCarthys of that era, and then a group of people in Europe who have basically taken the word and used it to describe demagogues. But that's a very different thing. A demagogue and a populist is a very different thing. A demagogue wants to concentrate all power in the individual, in his self, And the People's Party are like, it's the exact opposite. We're going to distribute all power. We're going to break all concentrations of power. So I think the people are going to win. The power, it's very important that we be honest with ourselves. Actually, the question about, what Ganesh just said about our power coming together as citizens, being sufficient, more than sufficient to win what we need to win, that statement is so important. But we also have to be very honest about the degree to which power has been concentrated now. It is as bad as it was a century ago, if not worse. Our challenge today is as great, if not greater, than it was a century ago. But so the first step towards victory is actually properly sizing up our opponents. But the good news is also that we have everything we need. Besides our masses, we also have everything we need. Simple principles, Jeffersonian principles, Madisonian principles, updated for the industrial era by Wilson and Brandeis and FDR. Those principles, we can now update those principles for this information era. And we can use them to build a people's republic. This may be the wrong thing. A democratic republic.
No. One more try.
A democratic republic in the 21st century in the United States.
A constitutional republic.
Yeah.
Ganesh, last word to you in this theme. I just want to mention the categories that you begin the book with. In the ancient world, there were 3 categories of government: kingship, aristocracy, and democracy, and each of them had a perverted form. Kingship led to tyranny, aristocracy to oligarchy, and democracy to mob rule. Today, can our current democratic republic or constitutional republic support the anti-monopoly, anti-middle-class constitution, or do we need checks on these new populist technologies that would ensure deliberation and resurrect this tradition, which has arguably been forgotten?
So I absolutely think that we can continue as a republic, but it's going to take us taking action to do so. And I'll partly just say one thing about the previous question too, which is, I think anybody, all of us in this room, I don't see any small babies here. So we all lived through the 2016 campaign and election, and I know many of us wish we had not lived through that election.
This is a nonpartisan crowd.
But we did.
Yeah.
No, hey, whether or not whatever side you're on, I don't think anybody wished we had spent 2
Fair
years
enough.
debating all that stuff.
Absolutely.
It was not a pretty election, and the campaigns, forget the outcomes, either way. But I think what was striking is that on whatever side you're on, both sides, I mean, the Bernie Sanders people, the Donald Trump people, lots of people supporting all the other candidates too, feel like there's something fundamentally wrong in the country right now. And that's a nonpartisan thing. Everybody feels like that. Maybe not everybody, but pretty much on all sides, there's people who feel like that. And I think that actually should give us cause for hope. And the reason why is because the one thing, even though we may seem very divided, is that we really share a sense that something is wrong and that we need to take action to address it. And I think that what we need to do is start having conversations about what we think is wrong and how we can do something about it. And I think when you look at a lot of what was channeled in the campaign on both sides, what you see is people are economically much more populist than they used to be. The Bernie Sanders crowd and the Donald Trump crowd were responsive to economically populist rhetoric on both sides. And I think that's an important part of the story, and that supports a sense that there actually is a constituency out there that cares very much about kind of anti-monopoly tradition, the middle-class constitution, and that feels like things aren't going in the right direction economically for a lot of people in this country. And I think that should give us hope, regardless of party, that we can do something because there is demand in the population and a recognition that we have real problems and that we need to undertake solutions to get there.
Ganesh and Barry, for teaching all of us about a crucial, forgotten, and necessary and vibrant constitutional tradition, thank you very much.